Hi everyone and welcome to Cred Consulting's first Creducation webinar, Understanding Social Infrastructure Needs and How to Fund Them. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we live and work. We pay our respects to the traditional custodians, ancestors and elders past and present. We recognise the strength and resilience and contributions of First Nations peoples and the eternal spiritual connection held in the lands, skies and waters through cultural practices and beliefs. Our team is proud to live, learn and thrive in a place we now call Australia and recognise sovereignty has never been ceded by First Nations people of the continent. As embedded in Cred's values, we are committed to building connected, healthy and resilient communities and creating purposeful outcomes that reflect our deep appreciation for the peoples and cultures that make us who we are and shape where we're going together as one. So, welcome, as I said, to our first Creducation. My name is Jen Geis. I'm a director here in Sydney with Cred Consulting, and I have the pleasure of leading you through this webinar today. We've joined with our friends from GLN today. So on the screen, you can see Jonathan. Hi, Jonathan. Before we get into it, I'm going to walk you through a little bit about our webinar situation. So down on the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a Q&A box. Please submit all your questions through the Q&A box. And you're welcome to use the chat, though it is a public forum, so please do be respectful if you want to chat amongst yourselves. But we won't be monitoring the chat for questions. All questions will be taken from the Q&A box, and I'll remind you throughout. So as you're hearing the presentations and you think of something, just pop it in that Q&A box. Thanks, Phoebes. As I said, we've partnered with our friends at GLN. So for those of you who don't know us, and I've looked at the list, I think we know most of you. It's so great to have you all here. I think we've got about 180 coming today. It's incredible. Cred Consulting is a national values-led social planning and engagement consultancy, and we've partnered with GLN today, who are a team of land use, infrastructure and funding specialists in Sydney and in Perth. Together, Cred and GLN have worked on needs studies and local contributions plans for the Inner West, Cumberland and Fairfield councils, and infrastructure delivery strategies for Pyrmont and Cherrybrook, amongst others. Today, I'll introduce you to our presenters and panelists. Firstly, introducing Sarah Riley. So not only is Sarah the Managing Director and founder of Cred Consulting and a genuinely wonderful human, she's also a specialist in integrated strategic and social planning for government and seeking the best outcomes for communities. Sarah's been successfully providing social infrastructure needs advice to government and the private sector for more than 15 years and understands how to influence positive change and decision-making for better community outcomes. Thanks, Sarah. Also introducing from Cred Consulting, Elise O'Ryan, Associate Director based in Brisbane. Hi, Elise. Elise is a graphic and visual communication whiz and is also an urban and social planner. She did not write that. Elise has a broad range of experience in preparing social infrastructure needs assessments, community facility strategies, community benefit analyses, and cultural and place plans, as well as designing community engagement programs and processes. From GLN, welcome to Jonathan Carl, Principal Infrastructure Planning. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan. Jonathan is a land use planning, infrastructure policy and funding specialist with more than 20 years experience spanning local and state government and consulting. And Jonathan enjoys helping councils navigate complexities of the New South Wales infrastructure funding system to develop and implement funding strategies that are integrated, practical and simple. I'm also going to introduce, though he's not joined us yet, he's on his way racing from another meeting, the wonderful Greg New, who's infrastructure funding and delivery consultant. So Greg is an expert in land use, infrastructure and development contributions planning. His 30-year career stretches across both government and the private sector. He's currently a member of the External Advisory Committee overseeing the implementation of New South Wales Government's infrastructure contributions reforms. He's also the former Vice President of the Planning Institute of Australia, and he's sat on the Planning and Infrastructure Committees of the Urban Development Institute of Australia as well. And we really look forward to Greg joining us shortly. So that's a little bit about us. We know that if new facilities such as libraries, theatres, parks, pools or playgrounds aren't delivered alongside new or growing communities, or if existing facilities aren't adapted to meet changing needs, there can be significant social, cultural, economic and political costs. So today we've partnered with GLN to share some nuggets of wisdom around how to identify social infrastructure needs, the value of planning for social infrastructure needs, funding approaches to deliver on social infrastructure needs, and sharing some stories of success from aspiration through to delivery. The agenda for today will be short presentations from Sarah, followed by Jonathan, and then we'll have probably around half an hour to answer your questions. And like I said throughout, please just pop your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to them in the second half of the session. So I hope you're enjoying your lunch. Let's get started. Over to you, Sarah.
Hello, everybody. There's a lot of friends in the audience today, and I'm really excited to be talking to you about something that anyone who knows me knows I'm incredibly passionate about and could talk for days and days about. But I'm going to talk for 10 minutes, and then at the end you can pick my brains, and I'm really excited to share some of the things that I've learned. And just an interesting thing that Greg knew was probably the first person I partnered with as a consultant about 15 to 20 years ago when I moved to Sydney. And what he taught me about the implementation, how to implement needs and my passion is invaluable. And I'm really excited that today we get to actually share some of that today as a team. Next slide, please. So when we talk about social infrastructure, what are we talking about? We're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about our libraries, which we know have incredible value for our communities, our community facilities, our halls, our hubs, our cultural facilities, which often get really ignored in our social infrastructure planning approaches, but those places for participation, for production, for viewing. Our public open space, probably one of the biggest challenges we're facing in terms of delivering what we need, and also our recreation facilities that are situated within our public open spaces, but also those indoor recreation facilities. Community housing, affordable housing, social housing, of course, is essential social infrastructure as well, but that's a whole other webinar. So today we're going to be focusing more on those facilities and spaces that we need for social connection. Next slide, please. We know that our communities are changing. In the greater cities area alone, the 6 cities, there's going to be another 2.1 million of us by 2041. We're increasingly culturally diverse. We're seeing our semi-rural areas adapting to become urban areas. We have age diversity, increasing density, and we have significant rising social inequality. So like Infrastructure Australia, I consider that social infrastructure is essential infrastructure. And when I started in this industry, social infrastructure was referred to consistently by government and the private sector as the soft and fluffy stuff. Lately, there's way more acknowledgement that it's essential, but sometimes it's a nice to have, and often it's left off the plan until there's no space left. And that's a bit of an issue. Post-COVID, we saw that our community facilities, our halls, our centres were being used for vaccination centres, for information centres, and during our floods and our fires, they were used as places of refuge for people who didn't have other homes to go to or who needed to access other information. And as a result, now Infrastructure Australia, I consider it as essential infrastructure, but unfortunately our contribution planning approach does not. But social infrastructure delivers so many benefits. These are just a few of them on the screen here, but there are so many more. And those benefits are not just social, they're economic as well, environmental and cultural. Next slide, please. So why do we need to understand needs? We need to understand needs for a lot of reasons. They are really a great information and evidence-based source for us to negotiate and plan better. They enable us to be ready for when funding does become available. So don't be afraid of having it. If you don't have it, when those grants come out, like the places to swim and places to play and all those infrastructure grants come out, you're ready to respond to them. And applying for a grant is normally a pretty short time frame. So be ready by understanding your needs. It enables you to plan strategically across districts and regions. We've been living in a situation of site-based planning for such a long time in Sydney, where we just consider what does a site need and what can a site deliver, which has meant that we've really lost spaces to deliver those really important pieces of infrastructure. And in particular, we're seeing it with our schools right now in many of our growth areas. They can inform our contribution plans, obviously, one of the really most important things. But they also inform planning proposals and the community benefits that can be offered by developers. And my experience working with some really fantastic private sector developers and the government developers is that they really appreciate understanding those needs up front to help inform that plan before it's too late. They also mean that you're able to respond and adapt to changing community needs as they emerge. Next slide, please. So what is a need study? A need study is something that every single local council should have. It is evidence-based plan that helps you understand what needs are, not just based on community engagement or not just based on benchmarks, but a range of indicators. When we do a needs study for a council, or sometimes it's for a site, or sometimes it might even be for a broader region or even the state sometimes, there's a range of indicators that we always consider in together. We look at the population, how it's growing, and what its demographic characteristics are. A young person might not need the same things as an old person. A person who's arrived here recently from another country might not need something as the same as someone who's been living in Australia all their lives. We look at the big strategic context. What are the big state drivers? We know there's a big push for quality public spaces. We know that there's a big push for multifunctional spaces. We look at the local strategic drivers as well and see what does that mean and what does that indicate we need. What are our participation trends? These are changing constantly. We know that now in the past, we might have just planned for team sports, but we know that informal recreation, walking, cycling, play are now our most popular participation for recreation. So what are they telling us about how we need to plan and what do we need in our communities? Most importantly, from our perspective as engagement professionals, talk to your communities and your stakeholders. People living in your community know those places inside out. They are not going to just tell you, I want this. They're actually going to help you understand how spaces are being used, how they can be improved, and what they might need for the future. And that can be an ongoing process throughout the whole needs analysis. Look at your capacity and utilization. Sometimes there's capacity to increase use in a certain area, and sometimes places are over capacity. So what does that tell us about what we need? Obviously, and something that we love to do is a really, really fantastic inventory of all the different social infrastructure that you have available currently, and mapping that so that you can get a spatial understanding of gaps in the area. And then the all-important benchmarking. And it's really important to have a benchmark. It's an aspiration, and we don't need to be as afraid of it as I often hear people are. Sometimes people will tell us that a benchmark is not achievable, so we shouldn't have it in a report, or we don't want to know about it. But it's a really, really important aspirational tool that can also help inform your contributions plans and negotiate with developers, because it is an evidence-based and proven quantitative measure of need. Once you've got all those indicators, then you have to go away and think about it and think about what does that mean for a local area, from a suburb to a district catchment, and then maybe to a broader LGA-wide catchment. And then provide a need study that can inform all these different things. Can inform, as we said, a development contributions plan, a council operation delivery plans, and other council strategies, including obviously open space strategies, but also master plans. And I think a really important thing to note is that it informs planning proposals and master plan studies. I've worked with so many developers who, if they had a council need study or a council strategy at hand, then they would know what council wants in a certain suburb or an area. And I also know that if council laws can be taken along the journey and they can endorse a need study and a strategy, then it's much, much easier to move forward and plan for what you need. I think I might stop there and hand over to Jonathan. I've done my 10 minutes, but I'm really excited to talk with you later and answer lots of questions about needs.
Thanks, Sarah. Before you jump in, Jonathan, just saying don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom as you're listening to the presentation. Over to you, Jonathan. Thanks.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to talk about funding social infrastructure. So this is the other side of the coin to needs planning. First thing I'll say is having a solid needs study with a robust evidence base just makes the job of preparing a sustainable funding strategy a million times easier. So it's really important that you get that, that first step of preparing the needs strategy right. So when you boil it down, infrastructure funding is about taking the needs study, getting a good handle on the costs, then thinking about the various infrastructure funding and delivery mechanisms, the funding that can be generated from those mechanisms, how much of the cost can be met from each of those mechanisms, putting the two together, so comparing the total costs and the total income. If the income is less than the cost, then going through a prioritization process, really trying to sort of match up the income and costs. If you do that process well, then what you should come up with is a sustainable infrastructure funding strategy. So I'll touch on each of those elements as I go through the presentation. Next slide, please, Jen. The first thing I'll say about funding is it's a multifaceted process. So there's lots of challenges that need to be, I guess, addressed as you go through the process. We've just got some of them down on the slide here. So community expectations. In recent years, expectations have been increasing, particularly during COVID. I think people have realised the value of social infrastructure. There's long time frames. So quite often we're talking about 5, 10, 15-year planning and delivery timeframes. You know, political cycles at council, state government might only be 4 or 5 years. So that sort of creates its own particular, I guess, challenges. There's political pressures. So you may have elected officials wanting to deliver particular social infrastructure items, which may not necessarily be the best allocation of finite resources. So again, that's where it's really helpful to have that solid evidence base in the needs study. It's multidisciplinary, so it cuts across a range of different specialties, which I'll touch on in a moment. Costs are increasing, so just in the last 12 months, you know, we're going through very high inflation at the moment, land costs, capital costs, people costs. You know, really, I guess it's a sort of dynamic aspect of the whole process. There's statutory complexities. So things like local infrastructure contributions, which is typically it's one of the important funding sources. You know, it's a very specialized area. There's funding constraints. So, you know, there's rate caps, there's contribution caps, various other types of constraints on funding. And it's also context specific. So it's not just a one size fits all. So you really need to look at I guess, the characteristics of the particular area that you're working in to come up with an appropriate infrastructure funding strategy. Next slide, please. So one of the best things you can do to deal with those challenges is actually adopt a collaborative process. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it's a multidisciplinary approach. There's lots of people that need to be involved. This slide lists some of the key stakeholders. I won't go through them, but I guess the key point that I wanted to make with this slide is it's really important that you think about who needs to be involved and how you're going to involve them, and you do that at the start of the process. Next slide, please. So once you've got a handle on the needs, you've thought about the challenges, who needs to be involved, you can then dive into the process of actually developing up the infrastructure funding strategy. This is a very simplified sort of summary of the key steps you need to go through. The first one is to estimate the costs, and I'll sort of go through each of these in a bit more detail in a moment. The next step is to consider the funding side. So that's looking at the range of infrastructure mechanisms available, the funding that could be generated through those mechanisms. Then go through a prioritization process. So that's about matching up the income and costs. And as I said, if the income is insufficient to meet the costs, then going through a process just to sort of bring the cost down to match the income. If you do that well, then hopefully what you should end up with is a funding strategy. And it's not just a strategy, it's a strategy that's sustainable, it's integrated, and it's holistic. Next slide, please. So the first step is to estimate the costs. The two key points here are you need to consider what costs need to be included. And the second part of it is getting good estimates of the costs. So when people think about costs, most people think about capital costs. There's also land costs, and there's also life cycle costs. So when we talk about life cycle costs, what we're talking about are maintenance costs, operational costs. So people, you know, for example, if you build a library, you need people to staff that library. And it also includes depreciation costs. So that's the cost of replacing the asset at the end of its life cycle. So again, to use the library as an example, if you've got a library, it might have a 40-year, 50-year depreciation period. So at the end of that 50-year period, effectively, you may need to build a new library. So it's really important that you consider all of those costs. So not just capital costs, land costs, life cycle costs. There's been examples over the years of councils where they've got into difficulties because they haven't considered the full range of costs. And the other point is to get good estimates, so accurate estimates of the costs. Again, there's been examples where councils have come unstuck. So there's two ways to do that. One is to, as I mentioned before, adopt a collaborative approach. So talk to the right people in council to get, look at past projects, look at actual costs, come up with benchmarks. The other option available is to go outside. So, you might engage a quantity surveyor, a land economist to get good estimates of the capital costs and the land costs. Next slide, please. So once you've considered the costs, the next step is to think about the funding sources. There's a range of planning and non-planning funding mechanisms available. I won't go into them in detail here, except to say that it pays to be creative and also collaborative when you're going through this process. So local infrastructure contributions, which I'll talk about in a moment, but there's a range of other mechanisms. So planning agreements, key sites provisions, conditions of consent. So yeah, it's don't just be, I guess, sort of narrow in the approach that you take to funding, sort of consider the full range. And we've got some examples at the end of that, at the end of this presentation, where we'll sort of touch on some of those other mechanisms. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned before, contributions is one of the most important funding sources. It's usually a good idea when you're looking at the funding mechanisms, you worked out which items are going to be funded through or potentially funded through local infrastructure contributions, to work out how much funding could be generated through local infrastructure contributions. It's important because it's typically a key funding source, but it also flows through in terms of, it may not fully fund many of the social infrastructure work. So it tells you what the funding gap is and what needs to be funded through some of those other funding sources. This slide just shows some analysis we did for a council recently. There's usually different approaches you can take to local infrastructure contributions, and depending on the approach that you take, it will affect the amount of income that's generated, and as I said before, the funding gap. So I won't go into detail here, but you can see that, depending on the option, the difference between in terms of the income, it can be quite significant. So the example here, it's about $200 million between the one that will generate the most income and one of the options that will generate less income. Next slide, please. So just following on from the previous slide, so one of the, I guess, characteristics of contributions is they may not fully fund the total cost of the infrastructure. So this is another example of some work we did recently, and it shows that for open space, contributions will fund about 2/3 of the cost. So total cost is just over $300 million. The forecast income from contributions is about just over $200 million. For community facilities, contributions, in this particular case, will only fund around 1/4 of the total costs. So I guess one of the points I wanted to make in showing this slide is that contributions is not always the kind of magic bullet that people often think it is. Contributions is a very sort of technical, specialized field. Usually, you might have a contributions planner in council who has a good understanding of it, but there's lots of other people that need to be involved. They may not have a good understanding of contributions, and quite often the perception is that, you know, contributions will solve all your problems, but quite often it won't. Next slide. So we've got a handle on the costs. We've worked out what the funding mechanisms are going to be. We've worked out what the income from contributions is going to be. As we saw in the previous slide, typically contributions won't fully fund. So one of the final steps is to work out what the funding gap is, and then work out how you're going to go about plugging that funding gap. So really, it's about, I guess, in practice, you've got an itemized list of the works, you've got a cost, you've got the funding from contributions, and it's about looking at the other co-funding mechanisms available, and just trying to work out how much of the remaining portion of the cost can be met through those other funding mechanisms. Typically, most cases, you'll end up with a situation where the costs or the income won't be sufficient to fully fund the costs. So what you need to do in that case is go through a prioritization process. So that's about bringing the cost down to match the forecast income. Options there includes deleting works, reducing the scope of the works, so to reduce the cost of particular works items. And the other option is to actually defer the work. So you might have a particular works item that's, might be scheduled to be delivered in the first 5 years. And you might defer that particular works item to, being delivered in years 6 to 10, for example. So that's about a cash flow. So that's the other side of things. It's not just about total cost over the particular particular planning timeframe. It's also a cash flow issue. So you break it down to short, medium, and long, for example. Next slide.
Jonathan, we're almost at time, just letting you know.
Sure. Okay. So if you go through each of those steps, you do it well. What you should have is a funding strategy that, as I said, it's actually does what it's meant to do. It's sustainable, it's holistic, it's integrated, it's got a works list, it's got the costs, the delivery mechanisms, and the funding. Next slide. Just a couple of quick examples. So on the left-hand side, we've got Marrickville Library, which is in Inner West Council. So this one was actually delivered by a developer at no cost to the council. So there was no local infrastructure contributions, nothing like that. It was council-owned land. I think there was a heritage hospital on the site that was converted, adapted for a library. Part of the site was given over to a developer. They developed that for residential development and used the profits generated from that development to pay for the library. So that's a really good example of a council getting a really amazing facility and just kind of thinking outside the square in terms of how they're going to go about funding infrastructure. The next example along is the Creative Hub in the City of Sydney. So that's 5 stories of production and performance space. It actually wraps around an existing above ground car park. Again, that was delivered at no cost to the council without using local infrastructure contributions. So again, that was a partnership arrangement with the developer. In that particular case, I think a planning agreement was used as the mechanism to secure that facility. The next example along there is Julian Reserve in Oran Park. I don't have much knowledge of that, but my understanding is that was delivered through a greenfields process. Sarah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's just probably one of my favorite social infrastructure outcomes in the community, highly activated, and it was based on a really solid understanding of what the needs of that community were, from a youth perspective to new arrivals from other countries to new people moving into an area which is transforming from more semi-rural to an urban area, and understanding those needs and then being able to plan for them and work with the developer to deliver them was a fantastic outcome. So again, it's just based on those nuanced and really unique needs of different communities to deliver really great outcomes in partnership, as Jonathan's talked about, through different mechanisms.
So I might wrap you up there, Jonathan. We can go to questions when you're ready, if you want to finish. Oh, we're done. Great.
We're done.
Excellent. Okay, so now over to your questions. Please pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But before we do that, hello, Greg. Welcome.
Hello, Jen. Can you hear me? We
can hear you loud and clear.
Good.
So glad. You've been weaving your magic in southwestern Sydney, I believe.
Oh, don't know about that. We had a good meeting though.
Excellent.
So,
well, and we're glad you're here. Fantastic. Okay, so Elise, we haven't heard from you yet. Hello.
Hi.
I've got a question for you, and it's about working together collaboratively like we do with GLN. So I'm interested in what value has the collaboration between CRED and GLN given you as a social planner, as an social infrastructure planner, sorry.
No, my goodness, so much value. And I feel like this is kind of short of a public declaration of my love for GLN. And Greg, I'm glad you arrived just in time for it. I've really enjoyed building a relationship with Greg and Jonathan over the last 6 years as I've started my career in social planning. I certainly know that they've taught me a lot and also taught CRED a lot about the pretty complex and changing world of contributions planning and kind of how we as social infrastructure planners fit in and have a role in that. In our line of work, we write a lot of community needs studies. And through many conversations with these two, I think that CRED have really honed a methodology for our needs studies that not only responds to council and community aspirations for their future social infrastructure network, but actually how to write them in a way that not only provides these guys with a really robust evidence base for their work, gives council kind of captures the aspirations of the community and of council staff for what they want their future network to look like. And yeah, hopefully makes GLN's job a little bit easier.
Amazing. Thanks, Elise. Okay, let's get into some of your questions. So the first question came in from Norma from Willoughby. Thanks for joining us, Norma. So panelists, just let me know who'd like to answer this one. I'm going to read it out. How important is the role of the community strategic plan, which every council is required to produce? It's presumably a good source of community needs and expectations on which councils can base their future planning. Also, the local strategic planning statements, which also set community benchmarks and targets. A great question. Thanks, Norma. I can see Sarah nodding. Let's go to you, Sarah.
Yeah. The community strategic plan is obviously the community's vision for the place that they live, and it should be setting the strategic directions for any social infrastructure needs study, strategy, master plan or planning proposal that comes across a council's desk. So if you're doing a needs study, you would always be informed by those big strategic drivers that have been identified in that CSP, and obviously that gets renewed by council every 4 years, so those things do change. And that's a really important thing to remember as well. The LSPS process, it also does set community benchmarks and targets for social infrastructure, but not every LSPS was driven because of the timeframes or based on a really evidence-based, super detailed, catchment-based social infrastructure needs analysis. And so that means that it might not always have been understood through an LSPS, but it should be a document that does drive those land use planning outcomes. So one is your community vision and the other is your land use plan. I think that also, but what a needs study can do more is just that really super detailed, nuanced understanding from a site all the way to an LGA. I hope that answers your question. Greg, did you want to add anything?
No, not really, Sarah. I know that the LSPS has had a requirement to either incorporate an infrastructure strategy or to develop an infrastructure strategy. So the LSPS process has been good in getting councils to think about, those councils that hadn't already been thinking about how infrastructure links with the land use outcomes.
That's right.
So it's been a good process from that point of view.
That's right, Greg. And I think just adding to that, that the land use question is the big question. And I can see some questions in there. You know, as Sydney has grown so much, as density increases, there's just less land. And so making sure that there is an identification of the land that can be set aside for social infrastructure not just a little pocket park, but those big regional sporting spaces, our
Mm.
primary schools. We've just seen 2 things in the paper recently about primary schools being part of retail developments with apartments on top. From a child safety perspective, I'm kind of like, if you can't fit the community facilities in, can you really fit more people in? So questions like that, and challenging the way we've been thinking for a very long time about land use. So I think from a strategic perspective, identifying those land use needs and keeping them aside for social infrastructure is so important, and LSPSs can do that.
Great, thanks everyone. Greg, I've got a little one that could be an essay, so we'll try and keep it succinct for you. And it is, when do you need a needs study and when do you not?
Okay. Depends which contribution specialist you ask. When do you need a needs study and when do you not? Well, I think it's horses for courses, depending on what the needs, what particular infrastructure needs you're talking about. Open space, community, and also the scope of the land, the area of land that you're dealing with. But generally, and the age particularly of the need study that you already have. But if we're talking about social infrastructure needs, like community facility needs assessment or an open space strategy, if you've got a strategy that's 10 or more years old, I think that's and you're doing an area-wide plan, like a LGA area-wide plan, then I think that's probably the limit of its usefulness. Preferably to be doing those sorts of studies every 5 to 8 years, I think would be the way to go. Does that provide an answer?
That is an answer.
It's an answer. I don't know whether it answers the question.
That's all right. That's great. Go on, Sarah.
Maybe Jen, from a contributions perspective, of course, you can just work it out based on a benchmark, but you're not going to be considering those really unique and nuanced needs of communities, and you might end up with some white elephants, or you might end up with things that just don't get delivered. So basing it on that really big understanding can be useful. Greg, is that right?
I think I go back a step, and so thinking maybe this is a question that evolves for rezoning lands on council's desk, and it might be a couple of hectares, or it might be a huge release precinct. I think with any rezoning that's bringing in substantial numbers of people, whether they be employees or the residents, then you're going to need a needs study. It's just that the scope of it and its flavour would be different depending on the scale. So if it's about a rezoning, what goes with the rezoning, a social infrastructure needs assessment or not, I think in most cases you will need a social infrastructure needs assessment.
Great, thank you both. Next question's for you, Jonathan. You ready? When you consider estimating costs such as land, capital, or life cycle costs, do clients also request consideration of opportunity costs?
Short answer to that is no. I've never had a client's council sort of request consideration of opportunity costs. I'm not quite sure what's meant by opportunity costs, but yeah, it hasn't come up in projects I've been involved in. Not sure if anybody else.
Greg's thinking.
I'm thinking about it being opportunity cost, meaning you have a certain number of dollars which you could spend that way, or equally you could spend it that way and get. Do you meet the need? Which is the best option for the dollars that you have? That's what I understand by opportunity cost, and I don't think it usually comes into. I mean, you do have sub options. Sarah might say this. You might have options come up with meeting social infrastructure needs, and if that's what's meant by opportunity cost, then yes, that does happen.
The person who asked the questions just clarified in the chat there, opportunity to use the land some other way.
We're talking about potential like council-owned land, which has, basically is underdeveloped and could be used for a variety of purposes. Because
We might wait on some clarification and come back to that one
Yeah.
if you don't mind. Yeah, that'd be good. Okay, next question from Mike down at Mary Beck. Hello, welcome.
Hi, Mike.
Hi. Okay, so bringing the community on the journey is, of course, the best approach. Yes. So what strategies have you seen to overcome fear or caution when executives want to answer a lot of the questions of what, where, and how before talking to the community? And Mike's provided the example as a major suburb centre revitalisation project, which needs maybe a mix of private development, social infrastructure, and affordable housing. And council is a big landowner. Do you want to start with that one, Sarah?
Yeah, sure. So, Mike, I think what you're saying is that your executives want a decision before they go to the community. And I think this is a really interesting one from an engagement versus research approach. So when we talk about community engagement as informing a social infrastructure needs study, that doesn't mean that we go out and do a survey that says, what do you want and where do you want it? It actually means that we do proper research with stakeholders who might be using spaces to understand gaps and demand. Or it might even mean that we do a telephone survey that is a piece of market research that gets a really good quantitative grasp on community sentiment around different things, which is different to going out to the community and testing plans or proposals, etc. So I think getting that evidence together through all those indicators that I showed earlier is really, really useful to bring executives on the journey as well. So I think you can kind of get yourself in order, do some engagement that is considered sort of more research to inform those proposals you're going to take to your executives, and then you can go out to the community. I think that's the only way I can answer what I think you're asking for there, but we do hear this a lot, that, well, don't go to the community, they're going to go crazy. But if you have done a research-based engagement prior, or research around your community sentiment, then that should help inform a really good proposal to take forward to the community. Do you want to add anything, anyone else?
I'd suggest going to the community with communicating basic information about what you're doing. I mean, you don't have to tell them everything at the start.
That's right.
But to have an engagement, of explaining the process of what you're doing, and its scope is I think very necessary. Yeah,
and I think you can kind of understand the what, and the community can help you then to understand the where and what its functions should be and what needs to be inside it and all those sort of things. But as community engagement specialists, we are always advocating for, like Greg said, inform the community that something's happening, get information from them as you go along, and then consult and iterate with them when you get down to those needs and how they might be delivered. Just be really persuasive, Mike. Tell them how important it is.
We'll come and help you, Mike.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, the next one is another big one, so let's try and keep it succinct so we can get through as many as possible. And it is, how do you quantify social value? Big question.
We can't. I don't think that's something that can be answered in this. We might have to do another webinar on that one. But I did share.
Maybe a PhD.
I think that's a whole different topic, but a great question. There's a really fantastic social return on investment report done by City of Parramatta in relation to sports spaces and sports grounds. I popped it in the answer to someone else's question. If you look, can people see the Q&A, Jen?
No,
I'll share it. I'll share it in the chat, and I would have a look at how they've done that, because it's a really fantastic assessment of the social value of green space.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, the next question is from our friend Justin. Hi, Justin, welcome. And he asked, can you discuss more how to get the balance right between high quality infrastructure that improves the public realm versus the funding challenge?
Can I start and then throw to Greg? Because someone else wrote a question in there about the 2.83 hectares per 1,000 people benchmark, which I know is terrifying to everybody, and it should be. Some suburbs aren't even that big. These days. So I think it kind of all links in, and what a need study does is identifies that there is a gap, whether it's via proximity or quality or quantum, but then it comes up with ways that need can be addressed, and that might be through embellishment or improving the quality of spaces. It might be through improved recreational links to connect up existing spaces. Having that benchmark and from a proximity and quantum perspective really helps you understand what that gap is. But that doesn't mean you have to deliver that gap. Then you have to get creative, like Jonathan was talking about being creative with funding. You have to get creative with how you can embellish and improve and have higher quality infrastructure that then, that can also solve the problem of the gap that you've got. So, Greg, do you want to jump in then around the funding challenge?
Oh, look, I think it's just an ultimate balance. That needs to play out in individual circumstances. What's the point of getting cheap materials if they're not going to last? But then again, having fountains and water play areas are considered, non-essential works, which is bizarre in, sort of Western Sydney context. People want them. I think it comes back to what Jonathan was saying before about the funding mix, that you need to, that's a very, very reason why you need a funding mix. And sure, it's a challenge, but, I would throw the standard of infrastructure in as one of the, things that has to be met through one funding source or another. What we want to avoid is crappy infrastructure, certainly.
Yeah. Any other comments, Jonathan or Elise? Nope. Great. Okay, let's move on. The next question came in from Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us, Elizabeth, who asks, or who states, we get pushback internally at council that social infrastructure costs, especially the ongoing running costs for council. Do you know if the increase in rates from increased population helps with the maintaining of a future park, for example?
Can I jump in?
Yes, Greg, please.
Okay, so one of our clients over the years has been Shoalhaven City Council, and we were asked to, a couple of years ago, prepare a financial model for them, which applied to a particular release area that was being decided upon as to whether, well, actually the decision to rezone had been made. Well, what we put to them, and they wanted, they were keen on the idea, was a financial model which looked at the 30-year life cycle, first 30 years of the development, to look at all revenues and all costs, including obviously recurrent costs for assets that were provided by the development that would come to council and then have to be maintained through rates. So the tools, there's a tool available, at least that we developed with the council, that can calculate this equation. And I noticed the pushback internally issue is very frustrating, particularly when it's based on a generalisation that we can't afford to maintain the assets. The line goes, we can't afford to maintain what we've got. How are we going to get any more? And it sort of shuts down the argument. And we've been frustrated with that, so we proposed this to Shoalhaven Council. And the initial results we got from the model was that, in fact, far from being, when you look at that release area on its own, far from being a drain on the council, it was going to be pretty much a net positive cash situation after 30 years. So yeah, look, knowledge is the key for people wanting to hit push back against the pushback.
Fantastic.
Knowledge is the key. Fantastic. Next question. Measuring soft infrastructure can be slightly more challenging than hard infrastructure, as it's not as easy to quantify and benchmark. Are there any is there any recent research to look to in regards to measuring the demand for soft social infrastructure? And how can we encourage developers and government that this is as equally as important? Something close to your heart, Sarah.
So when we're saying soft infrastructure, I'm assuming we're referring to the services and the programs that operate within our buildings, our libraries, etc. And this is such a complex issue because a lot of those services are funded at a federal level or at a state level, but they're delivered in facilities that are built or owned by local government. And so it does raise that funding issue as well. So how do you convince people? There's so much ideology behind this as well. Obviously, we know that without access to services, our communities can suffer, particularly our young people accessing training programs, older people having social connection activities, people with disability being able to meet up with other people as part of services and programs. And I don't know that there are, specific benchmarks that you can apply for that. At all, unfortunately. But I think you can encourage them to provide the spaces that services and programs can be delivered within, whether they're inside or outside, and potentially form partnerships with local services in the local community to operate those centres. And I could get into backbone organisations and all sorts of things, but that is a common approach now, is to get a really fantastic NGO or someone else to partner in the delivery of a social infrastructure or the management of that into the future, which also reduces council's operational costs of that space.
And Sarah, do you think it'd be fair to say as well that often it's a council by council approach, depending on their position about how they want or how much they want to support the delivery of externally funded services within their facility? So it is often a conversation with executives and with council staff about what that particular council's position is. Absolutely true, Elise. And I think childcare is one of the main, if you want to call that a soft service, it's literally an essential service. And since it was deregulated in the market about 15 years ago, and as a result has become pretty much a privately delivered social service now, but used to be pretty much the domain of local government and not-for-profit services. So I absolutely agree. Every council has to be clear about what their role is and what they want to deliver for their communities. It's a big part of the question at the beginning of doing a needs study.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Okay, our next question came from David Matthews. Thanks, David. How do the panelists view having community facilities recognised as essential facilities, especially now the reforms seem to have been dropped, yet need studies can and do identify their benefit to community in both green and brownfield growth areas? Who's going to jump in on that one?
It's going to be Greg or Jonathan, that one.
I'll let Jonathan go first.
No, Greg, I'll let you.
All right.
Come on, guys.
Because Jonathan's has a real love-hate or hate-hate relationship with Essential Works List. Hi, David. How are you? David Matthews, is it right? Look, Essential Works List. It started as a band-aid in 2008 or 2010 or around that period, when New South Wales housing approvals were compared to the rest of the nation at rock bottom. The cap came in. Along with it was a notion called Essential Works, which was going to be the limit of what you could levy for contributions plans that were above the cap and went through the IPART process, etc. We could talk about the history. It's not very useful, except to say that I think it's outlived its usefulness, the Essential Works List, so-called. There's got to be a better way. I think I don't think we could necessarily go back to the way where it's open slather with any and every facility to be included in plans. But certainly the situation in Greenfield, certainly in brownfield versus greenfield situations, there is a case for community buildings to be included in contributions plans. The limits of that is the problem. How much is charged. So look, in short answer is, David, I think the reform process has fallen down in terms of it being shelved. We didn't get much of a response from IPART, in my view, on the reviewing the Essential Works List. We got a status quo, and even as I recall, I think the IPART saying that councils should make a conclusion as to what's essential and what's not. I mean, well, if you're not getting guidance from the state, then what's the point? So I think it's time for a real rethink about essential works as a concept.
And can I just add really quickly, Greg, because I know we're just about out of time, that just because something isn't identified through a contribution plan as essential doesn't mean it can't be funded or delivered in other ways. And having a needs study sets an aspirational target that you want to deliver for your community, so that when those opportunities arrive, whether it be via a negotiation with the developer through a VPA, or whether it be through a grant from the New South Wales government or the federal government, and we've just seen through the budget, there's lots of money hopefully coming for better wellbeing and social outcomes in our communities now. Having that aspirational document, having that need study means you are ready for that conversation when it arises. It doesn't just have to be delivered through essential works.
Absolutely, Sarah, having an aspirational document, but I'd go further in saying that it identifies the high priorities, the priorities of your infrastructure aspirations. So you're ready for the grant application, you're ready for the developer that comes in with a planning proposal on a site. It's time to talk turkey in terms of social infrastructure ingrained and embedded in that proposal, for example. So yes, definitely. That's where the need study is the most value.
Great. We have 2 questions left. Let's see if we can get through them in 3 minutes. So from Sean Perry, how useful are benchmarks as a blunt population-based tool, and how do you derive best practice benchmarks when consistency across councils is limited and there are no statewide standards?
Okay, we've literally got 3 minutes, Greg, so we're going to do this in 30 seconds. I'm going to do this in 30 seconds. A benchmark is an excellent tool to set an aspirational target, but that probably might not be able to be delivered, but it still sets that target. And I think, Greg, if you could talk about how they stand up in court, that's a really, really good thing. I personally think councils can derive their own benchmarks based on the unique needs of their area, whether they're a highly dense urban area, a super geographically dispersed area, of course, but there are so many out there that you can choose from. And I would say we're probably never going to get statewide benchmarks, particularly around open space, because that would require the state to also deliver on those benchmarks. So I think it's really, really important for councils to think it's okay to deliver benchmarks based on ones that have stood up in court. And there are many of those, Greg. Is that good?
Oh, look, any benchmark that's been well researched, it should stand up.
Yep.
Not sure what court we're talking about.
Sorry, if there was a disagreement.
But the point you make is right. Is that well, the point I would make is that benchmarks are valid. Benchmarks are needed because they drive the determination of a specification for a particular facility. So it's an amount of GFA, or it's amount of numbers of items per 1,000 people, whatever it is. Until you have that specification, you can't put a cost to it, and you can't put it in a contributions plan. So that's all I would say. They're still very important. They do go alongside with need studies. They're part of need studies. That's all I'd say.
Great, thank you. That leads us to the end of our time together. Apologies if we didn't get to your question today. Phoebe is going to pop in the chat now a survey link. We would really appreciate if you could do that. It's 3 questions or so. It really is going to help us plan for more of these Creducation sessions. I hope you like what we did there. And we really hope through these sessions that we can support you in realising great community outcomes for the future. As part of living our values, we believe that sharing our expertise and our experiences to build a network of passionate change makers is really important in the world. Please do get in touch with us, either Cred or GLN or both of us, if you have more questions or if we can help you on your journey. Our emails and websites are on the screen now. Thank you so much to our friends, Jonathan and Greg. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for all the panelists, Sarah and Elise, and thank you to everyone for joining us for our first ever Creducation webinar. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, everybody.
See you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.